Hello and welcome back to Murphy's Let's Draw. This is a tutorial on the 180-degree rule in visual storytelling. It will explain what the 180-degree rule is, why it matters, and how we can use, bend or break it through a scene to tell a clear and engaging story. The first question we're going to ask is, what is the 180-degree rule? And the answer to that question is fairly straightforward. The second question is, how do you use the 180-degree rule? And because the answer to that question is, it depends, the second half of this tutorial is going to be a little bit longer. We're still going to focus on the facts, but something doesn't have to be simple just because it's true. The short answer. The 180-degree rule is originally a filmmaking term, but understanding the rule and how to apply it is just as crucial for most other types of visual storytelling. When you have control over what your audience sees, either because you're deciding to draw this and not that, or placing your camera here and not there, you will have to make informed decisions about what you show and how you show it. I'm mostly creating this tutorial with comic artists in mind because I have much more experience with and interest in comics, but the language of film is so universal that even comic artists will talk about an imaginary camera when they really mean a literal point of view. So to keep things simple, let's just go ahead and imagine that you're a filmmaker for now. You have a location to film in, you have a subject that you want to film, and you have a camera that you need to point towards your subject. Seen from above, it's clear that you could place your camera anywhere as long as it's pointing towards your subject. In other words, you have 360 degrees of different angles to choose between. But if you move the camera too far in between shots, it can cause some confusion for the audience. That's why the 180-degree rule states that you're limited to 180 degrees of movement, at least in between shots, if you want to maintain visual clarity. The full circle is divided into two halves by an imaginary line, which we're just going to go ahead and call the line for the rest of this tutorial. Breaking the 180-degree rule is called crossing the line, which is fun because it makes it sound so much more ominous than it really is. I'll illustrate the rule using a dialogue scene between two characters. The short example. So, what do we need from a dialogue scene? We need to see where the characters are in relation to each other, and we need to see their faces to understand who's saying what and how they're feeling about it. Here's person A talking to person B. We can see that they're facing each other and that they're standing rather close in some sort of beige void. We've also established their placements within the frame. Person A is on the left of the frame and person B is on the right. And this is going to be important. The imaginary line runs through both characters, and we'll see why it has to as the example goes on. When it's time to cut to another shot, we can reposition our camera to show more of one person's face or the other. Because we haven't crossed the line, the characters don't just stay in the same place in the room, they also stay in their established spaces within the frame. We can look over the shoulder of person A or person B, but person A is always to the left of the frame and person B is always to the right. If we show only person A in the shot, as long as they're facing in the same direction as before and staying roughly on their side of the frame, the audience will understand that person A is still looking at and speaking to person B. An eagle-eyed viewer might have noticed by now that I haven't actually used the full 180 degrees in this specific example. That's not because it should actually be called the 150-degree rule, or however many degrees I ended up using. Please don't ask me to do maths, I've suffered enough. It's just because the rule is not the only thing that matters when you decide where to place your camera. If we use the full 180 degrees in this specific example with the characters still turned to look straight at each other, we'd end up filming the back of somebody's head, which is probably not going to show the audience anything very interesting. Breaking the rule. So far we've demonstrated how to follow the rule, but what happens if we break it? If we cross a line in between cuts, the characters will appear to swap places with each other. That can create a moment of confusion for our audience and prompt them to ask some questions. Did the characters swap places in between shots? How did we get here? If the characters look even slightly similar to each other, who's who? And maybe more importantly, was this intentional? Am I supposed to feel confused? Because you are, of course, allowed to break the 180-degree rule whenever you want to. And many expert visual storytellers do. Pushing our audience to ask questions is usually one of our main goals with every scene we show them. Most of the time in a dialogue scene, it will be simple questions like, how is this character feeling? And what are they going to do next? But in another scene, we might want the audience to ask, what is the nature of reality? Who am I? Crossing the line can create confusion and disorient the viewer. Whether that's the right choice or the wrong choice depends entirely on the situation. Yes, that means that I'm kicking the ball over to your side of the court and forcing you to make your own choices. Frustrating, isn't it? But before I do, I'll try to narrow those choices down a little by showing some practical examples of how you can use or break the rule as an intentional part of your storytelling. The long answer. So rather than simply listing out examples, I thought I'd take you along for the ride as I plan out an entire scene from start to finish. It will begin simple enough with our main characters meeting and talking, but soon enough perspectives will shift, tensions will rise, and both hearts and private property will be broken. That way we can cover a wide variety of the different basic complications that the 180-degree rule can throw at us. Our three characters are Alice the alligator, she, her, Bernie the bear, they, them, and Charlie the cheetah, he, him. Alice and Bernie are meeting up at a cafe, and Charlie is their barista. Each character uses different pronouns, just so that I don't have to state each character's name over and over when I'm talking about them. The first thing I need to do is to plan out my location. So here's the cafe seen from above, here's the inside, here's the outside, the window, the door, the tables, and the counter. This little symbol represents the imaginary camera, and what it points at is what the audience will see. To keep the camera movements extra clear and help illustrate my examples, I'll bring this graphic back every now and then to illustrate any dramatic movements of the camera, just to make things extra clear. And if you're like me and this reminds you of the Metal Gear Solid radar, please just go ahead and pretend that I'm talking about Metal Gear Solid. That's what I always do when I have to listen to somebody else for more than a minute at a time. Setting the scene. So we've got our characters and we have our location. Now it's time to set the scene. I'll start with an establishing shot of the exterior of the cafe and Alice nicely framed sitting by the window. The very next thing I'm going to do is kind of cheeky because I'm going to go ahead and break the 180-degree rule by showing Alice from almost the complete opposite direction. There's a few reasons why I can do this without confusing the audience. Alice hasn't moved. She is alone, and she's still very clearly the focus of the shot or the panel. The location we've established is very familiar to almost any viewer, and we've also very obviously moved from the exterior to the interior. Especially because of this last point, it's really not so much of a rule break as it is an example of when the rule just doesn't apply. And even if it did apply, the 180-degree rule only matters insofar as it helps you communicate spatial relations effectively. It's not necessary to follow this rule when there's no real risk of confusion. Now that we've moved from the outside of the cafe to the inside, we've established a new 180 degrees and a new line not to cross. And because we're mostly going to stay in this location, it's much more important that we follow the rule from this point on. Looking over Alice's shoulder, we see Bernie entering the picture. Alice is to the right of the frame and Bernie is to the left, and we're going to keep that arrangement for the time being as we move in between shots. We can then cut to see Bernie enter the cafe, and because the camera is still just behind Alice's shoulder, we can take in more of the location without feeling as if our perspective has changed very much. Bernie sits down and they begin talking. We can cut to shots looking over each character's shoulder or to close-ups to show more of their gestures or emotions. As the scene goes on though, repeating these very limited angles over and over again can start to feel really stale. That means that there's a real temptation now to cross the line just to vary up the visuals. If we did, we'd end up seeing something like this, and we risk the kind of confusion that I mentioned in the first part of the tutorial. Even with a background, the audience might assume that Alice and Bernie have switched places. That means that we're going to have to think of some other clever ways to keep things interesting. Switching places. Perhaps I wanted to cut to this shot because I actually meant for my characters to swap seats. With everything I've explained so far, it's starting to sound as if the 180-degree rule limits my options no end. If the characters have to stay in their assigned parts of the frame, it might seem like they have even less room to move than my camera. It's true that up until now, I've kept Alice and Bernie in their set arrangement, but that doesn't mean that they have to stay there. Remember, the 180-degree rule restricts movements in between shots, not movement within shots. As long as I plan things out a little in advance, I can let my characters do whatever their hearts tell them, even if that means they'll bounce off the walls, teleport, or turn temporarily invisible. For the sake of simplicity, I'll play things a bit more safe and just make Alice and Bernie switch places, both within the frame and within the room. I'll also restrict them to moving like most people do, and state that besides being talking animals, neither of them has any magical powers. Let's say that Alice is bothered because the sun is shining in her eyes, and Bernie offers to swap seats. Now, I don't just have an excuse to draw something a little bit different. I also have a way to convey something about my characters through dialogue and action. That could be that Alice is not in the habit of actually asking for what she wants, perhaps because she knows that Bernie is nice enough to offer it anyway. I can't just cut from Alice's complaining to the two characters sitting in their new seats. Because of the dialogue, the question probably won't be, "What happened?" but, "Did they teleport? You just told me that they don't have any magical powers." When anything moves through a space I've created, I need to take the viewer along with me. If I show them getting up, crossing the space and sitting down again, everything will be crystal clear. It's probably not necessary to show the entire movement from start to finish, especially in a comic where it can be tricky to convey time, speed, and movement. The important thing to include is this frame, where the two figures overlap while each is heading in the opposite direction. If I multitask with my drawings by showing a smile, a frown, a pat on the shoulder, or a mean-spirited bump as they cross paths, I can solve a technical problem while still adding something more interesting to these moments that can otherwise feel like a bit of a chore. So here's our new arrangement: Bernie to the right and Alice to the left, but we still haven't crossed the line. The camera has also moved slightly, so that when we re-establish the scene, we're once again looking over Alice's shoulder. We can go back to a shot-reverse shot without confusion. We can cut to a close-up of Alice and understand that when she looks off to the right, it means that she's looking at Bernie. Clearly, this doesn't give us the most exciting new set of visuals. There's all sorts of ways for characters to move, and there's all sorts of reasons why the story might need them to. Many of them are definitely more interesting than two characters switching seats just because one of them left home without sunglasses. The point is that as long as you communicate things clearly, you don't have to choose between breaking the 180-degree rule or keeping each character locked into their assigned spots. Adding characters. Dialogue scenes between two people are quite easy to frame, but if we add a third character or more, things can quickly get trickier. As Charlie heads over to take their orders, we're going to have to make some decisions about how he should be placed and how much of a disruption he should make in our already established dynamic. We could cut to him walking across the frame and taking up positions in between Alice and Bernie. That means that he's quite literally getting in the middle of their conversation, and especially if he's an important character, that could be a great way to signal that the scene is about to move in a new direction. On the other hand, that means that we can't easily go back to using shot-reverse shot to show this conversation, unless we're okay with him jumping from one side of the frame to the other. We're not crossing the line, but we still risk confusing the viewer about who's where and whether or not they've moved. And if we cut to a close-up of Charlie, it could be unclear what he's looking at, unless we've just used a wide shot to show exactly which way his head is turned. It's important to point out that if we want to keep spatial relations clear, following the 180-degree rule or sticking to set character placements within the frame won't be enough. It's not even really the most important thing to consider. Character design, distinct backgrounds, and frequent wide shots will also help the audience to tell people and placements apart and reorient them within the scene. As long as you put enough effort into all of these things, you can afford to rely a little more on other factors when you need some freedom to move. If your drawing skills are not quite there yet, you can still make a really great comic, but you might want to stick to simpler and less varied framing just to be on the safe side. Have you read XKCD? It's an old favorite of mine, although I'm ashamed to say I'm not as good at keeping up with webcomics as I used to be. To me, one of the most impressive things about this comic is that the creator doesn't just keep things visually simple, he's made entire strips without using any backgrounds or distinct character designs whatsoever. The reason why we can read this comic without wondering who's who is because we instinctively understand or assume that the 180-degree rule is not being broken. The framing does all the work of keeping things clear, meaning that the rest of the visuals can be pared back to the bare minimum without making the reader feel as if anything is missing. Conversely, if you want the freedom to really play around with your framing, the designs, both for your backgrounds and for your characters, will have to be much more distinct so that the reader can still tell what's happening without having to stop and think. Even if Charlie is a little all over the place, framing the conversation in this way could still work. The audience is familiar with the space by now. Each character is color-coded. Charlie is the only one standing up, and each wall of the room has some distinct feature that helps us tell them apart. But especially since Charlie is not a very important character to this scene, let's find a way to keep him off to one side. Sorry, Charlie. When Charlie enters the frame from the right, we can cut to a close-up of Alice, where she keeps her established position and line of sight while she gives her order. Then when it's Bernie's turn, we can push the camera in closer. Now if we focus in on Charlie for the same close-up as before, we won't be so unsure of what he's looking at. Charlie can then walk off again, and in this example, we've neither broken the 180-degree rule or changed the character positions within the frame. Changing perspectives. Up until this point, the camera has been guided by Alice's line of sight in most of our wide shots, and most of the close-ups have centered on her. She was also the very first character we encountered. Considering all of this, we can assume that she's meant to be our point of view character. Of course, this would need to be reinforced through dialogue and all sorts of other storytelling tricks, but if we look at the camera placements alone, Alice has been our main focus. The audience probably either interprets the scene from her perspective by now, or they will at least think that I, the creator, would like them to identify with her. Perspective, point of view, seeing things a certain person's way. When we try to explain how a person feels, what they think, or even how they think, it's tough to find the words for it without bringing vision into it. That's another reason why framing or camera placement is so important. So let's say that our audience sees things Alice's way, partly because my camera placement has told them to. But should they? Perhaps I'd like to change perspectives halfway through the scene. That might be because it will help me to sell a plot twist, or maybe I'm trying to make some very important point about the dangers of unexamined bias. Either way, that change of perspective will be more effective if it's literal as well as figurative. Now, we've spent some time finding ways to change things up without having to cross the line. I've established that jumping from one side of the circle in between shots can be quite confusing, especially if we're staying within the same room or location. But this could really be one of those times where a little confusion is just what we need. If we cut to another exterior shot of the cafe, we can quickly communicate a change in the scene while still showing exactly where both characters are. Especially if this shot lingers, either by staying on the screen for a while or by taking up a lot of space on the page, we can also get time on our side while we reorient our audience. Then we can push in for a close-up with a new established line to follow. There's also another way to do this, one which doesn't break the rule and doesn't put so much weight on the drawings to help keep things clear. My goal isn't just to show a shift in the perspective, but I would actually like the audience to side with Bernie rather than with Alice for the rest of this interaction. Instead of crossing the line in between shots, I can have my rule cake and eat it too by showing the entire movement. By cutting from one angle to another as I gradually move around Bernie and then stopping while we're still closer to their side of the room, I can respect the rule and also have them take up much more space in the frame. Either approach can be a weaker or a stronger choice depending on all the considerations we've already covered, and perhaps depending a little bit on the medium you're using too. I've been talking about moving the camera, but of course in comics, nothing actually moves, so the second solution could get a little bit long in the tooth. On the other hand, the first solution will require really clear backgrounds and very distinct character designs. Whichever path we end up taking, the end goal is to show that our focus has changed. Close-ups, expressions, and dialogue will help make this work, and if it does, we can let the scene play out and trust that from now on, Bernie's thoughts and feelings will seem of slightly higher importance. Action. So now that we're starting to side more with Bernie, both literally and emotionally, it won't be quite so jarring when Alice starts to act like a real jerk. The conversation is getting heated, and eventually things get physical as Alice flies out of her seat and tries to attack Bernie. Up until now, the camera movements have mostly been gradual, slight, or slow, and the movements of the characters themselves have been calm. Now, we have some decisions to make, because especially in an action scene, framing really sets the tone. If we stay up close and personal and move across the space with our camera positions alongside our point of view character, we can make the audience feel almost as if whatever is happening to them. Staying at a distance can make us feel detached, as if we're not in the action at all, but watching, frozen in place and unable to help. Flat static shots are more associated with comedy. As always, it's possible to mix and match or to change things up. The important thing is just to make informed decisions with your framing. I'm going to opt for close and personal in this example. With this type of framing, a certain level of chaos is useful, which means that it's more difficult to maintain visual clarity and more tempting to break the rule. So Alice is chasing Bernie. Especially since Bernie is our new point of view character, this would be a great time to check in with them to see how they're feeling. In this shot, we see Bernie and Alice both moving from the right side of the frame to the left. When we cut to a close-up, it's very important to respect the rule so that Bernie is still shown moving in the same direction. If we instead cut to this view, the movement doesn't carry over from one shot to the next, which means that we lose momentum at best, or at worst, we misinterpret the movement as having changed direction. Adding a background won't help much either. In a film, a shot like this probably won't be on screen for long. And in comics, we rely on the size, shape, framing, and content of a panel to communicate pacing to the reader. We don't want them to linger on this image, so adding the smaller details required for a clear background would only slow the action down. Almost no matter what we do after crossing the line in this way, the audience will assume that we're going to cut from this frame to this, as the two characters run right into each other. So what if Bernie does change direction? The cafe is only so big after all. Eventually, they will either have to turn heel or start fighting. Just like before, we need to show them moving through the space and past Alice. So if we cut to this, Alice and Bernie are still in their established parts of the frame, and we're still quite close to them. Bernie turns and runs, and because we see them turn, we can then show them moving in the other direction across the screen without confusion. The two characters have swapped places within the frame, but that's what the audience will expect in a scene where one character chases another back and forth. The direction of the movements is clear, the dynamic between the characters is clear. We haven't crossed the line, and we can still see where everything is in a space that we already know and love like the back of our shared hand. Exit pursued by an alligator. Since Bernie is opting for flight rather than fight, it makes sense that they will eventually head for the exit. Now we have another dilemma. We could cut to this, which would let us keep the momentum and direction of the movement as Bernie legs it down the street. On the other hand, the movement direction is pretty much the only thing that we maintain. I did start this scene by arguing that it's okay to cross the line when moving from one location to another, but this time doing so means introducing a whole new location to the audience without a clear transition. That might not be the best move if we want to keep up the pace, especially now that we're nearing the end of the story. There's also no clear indication of how this location is connected to the previous one. Is this street beside the cafe or is it on the opposite side? Did Bernie already run to the other end of town? So for the very last time, and I promise it really is the last time, we'll instead cut from the previous shot to another exterior view of the cafe. We see Bernie running out the door and turning as they exit. Especially if we show the speed they're moving at and the sharpness of the turn, this doesn't have to slow either Bernie or the scene down very much. Then we can show Bernie running off with the line uncrossed, their new direction intact, and a very clear finale to this terrible coffee date as Bernie gets as far away from Alice and the cafe as possible. The end. That concludes both this example and this tutorial. Of course, there's many possible complications and solutions for staging a scene that I haven't covered. But hopefully I've explained the 180-degree rule well enough to help you find your own fun ways to work either with it or against it. Make sure to reread your favorite comic or rewatch your favorite film and pay special attention to the framing, and I'm sure you're going to find a lot of inspiration. You might also find some great examples of when a story has you so engaged, you don't even notice when it breaks the rules. If you have any specific burning questions left unanswered, please let me know in the comments and I will do my very best to answer them. Perhaps I'll even do a follow-up tutorial or a deeper dive on framing sometime, if the interest is there. Thank you so much for watching. If you like what I do, take a moment to check out my Patreon. These kind people already support me there, and they help to make this project possible. Comments, likes, and subscriptions, or sending a link of this video to a friend are also some really great ways and very cheap ways to give me a boost, both practically because it helps with the YouTube algorithm and emotionally because it makes me very happy and very flattered. Until next time, take care, and thank you for learning with me.